Thank you very much, Mr. Cook, for talking to the Voice of America.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good to be with you.
Secretary Pompeo has warned the international community that Iran right now already has the largest ballistic missile force in the Middle East. What are you hearing from our allies in the region? Are they concerned about that?
I think our allies in the region are very concerned about it, but we're also seeing more expressions of concern globally. Yesterday, I was with Secretary Pompeo in the UN Security Council where we had a discussion about Iran's missile program. And you had nations from every region of the world express concern about Iran's missile testing and its missile proliferation and its regional aggression. I think the media sometimes overstates America being alone in the world. That's not true. We do have a disagreement with the Europeans and China and Russia over the Iran nuclear deal. But when you go beyond the Iran nuclear deal, you see a very similar threat assessment.
Iran's leaders are insisting that they are within their rights testing these ballistic missiles. What is your reaction? What are your thoughts on this claim?
For 12 years, the UN Security Council has been meeting on a regular basis to discuss Iran's outlaw missile program, its missile testing and its missile proliferation in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Yemen. And this missile proliferation is destabilizing the Middle East. I think more nations understand that. In the UN Security Council, I was one of the lead negotiators of the resolutions that imposed the ban on Iranian ballistic missile testing. And it's very unfortunate that the Iran nuclear deal didn't keep in place as strong as standards. But even with the lower standard, Iran is still acting in defiance of the UN Security Council. They are violating the clear intent of the UN Security Council that they stop the missile testing and missile proliferation. There's nobody in the Council that wants Iran to continue testing missiles and proliferating.
You mentioned, sir, the United Nations. Now, if the UN embargo on the export of major conventional weapons to Iran is lifted in 2 years, what are the dangers that you see in that?
I think this is the last revolutionary regime on earth. And this is also the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world. That is something that we've got to be very worried about when you lift the arms embargo. Because what we've seen with the Iran nuclear deal was an effort by the United States and other nations to see if Iran would moderate its revolutionary activity. It was to some extent a bet. It was an act of good faith, especially by the Obama administration, to see if by granting sanctions relief, and it's big sanctions relief, it was $100 billion in sanctions relief, $1.5 billion in cash. That was the best opportunity that this regime will ever have to get on a better footing with the United States. And instead of investing that money in their own people, they spent it in Syria on Assad. And they spent it in Iraq on their militias, and they spent it on the Houthis in Yemen. The average, thanks to Iran, the average Lebanese fighter makes more money than the average Iranian firefighter. And this is something which the Iranian people uniquely understand, that instead of investing the sanctions relief in them, they spent it on violent wars overseas.
Now, in November, the United States reimposed full sanctions on Iran. Do you have any data showing how effective these sanctions have been already?
On the oil side, we've got very good analysis there. When we put in our sanctions in place in May, when the president announced that he's leaving the deal in May, over the following 6 months, nations around the world reduced their imports of Iranian crude by over 1 million barrels. That is a loss of many billions of dollars to this regime. 80% of the regime's revenues come from the export of oil. And they used that revenue then to spend it, as they usually spend it, on revolutionary activities outside of Iran. And so our banking sanctions, the SWIFT financial system, has disconnected all of the same banks that we have designated. Iran does not comply with FATF banking standards. And the regime doesn't want you to follow the money. disconnecting all these Iranian corrupt banks from the SWIFT financial system is going to have an effect, and it's going to impede the regime's ability, I think, to finance terrorism and to essentially execute on the range of malign activities that they do.
Iranian leaders are claiming that the shortage of medical supplies stem from the U.S. sanctions against Iran. Is this true?
It's false. The Iranian regime knows very well that the Treasury Department has put out guidance for those Iranians who are allowed to access the internet without having to go around all sorts of mechanisms that the regime puts in place. They can go to the Treasury Department website and see very clearly that our sanctions regime exempts food, medicine, and medical devices. The biggest problem that we have implementing that and making that a reality for the Iranian people is the regime sets up front companies. These front companies are disguised, they sound like they're humanitarian. In fact, they're run by the Revolutionary Guard Corps. And instead of then expediting humanitarian assistance to the people, they take that money and then they spend it in Syria. So banks know this. Banks around the world know that Iran uses front companies that are disguised as humanitarian organizations. They also know that Iran doesn't comply with international banking standards. So if the regime would start have an open and transparent banking system, and they would stop using shell companies, it would allow banks to actually finance humanitarian assistance. So the burden on this is with the regime. And it's also the case, the regime, if they want to spend it on food, medicine, and medical devices for their people, they can. They choose not to.
If I may, sir, I want to ask you about the continuation of the protests around the country. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that? What is the U.S. position regarding these protests, and what does it say about the overall situation inside Iran?
Since this regime took power in 1979, every single decade they've been in power, they have lost another segment of society. And the most recent example of that is there were strikes. The truck drivers were on strike, teachers were on strike. Since 2013, this regime has spent $16 billion in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Imagine if that money had been spent on schools and on better roads and on addressing land mismanagement so farmers could have land that they could farm. Just think how different Iran would be. But this is a regime that generally doesn't puts its ideology ahead of its own citizens. And so we continue to see domestic unrest. We expect it's going to continue because since '79, the regime has struggled with this. And I would also say more broadly, since 1905, the Iranian people have sought a more representative government. The constitutional revolution in 1905, all the way up to the Green Revolution, are various expressions by the Iranian people of having a government that truly represents their interests. And honestly, the United States spends more of its time trying to really validate and support the interests of the Iranian people more than this regime does.
What are your thoughts on the diaspora and on the opposition groups abroad? Do you support them? And if they could have a role to help people inside Iran, what could that role be?
Secretary Pompeo and I have made it a big priority to spend time with the Iranian diaspora. He flew all the way to California to give a speech at the Reagan Library. 1,000 people attended it. It was probably the most exciting speech I've heard with the crowd. It was very supportive, and it was just a really touching moment. We then had dinner with various folks from the Iranian diaspora. During the UN General Assembly, I met with them. When I travel overseas, I look for opportunities to meet with them. We think it's important to stand with the Iranian people, whether they live in the United States or Europe or the Middle East or in Iran. And so just a couple of days ago, I asked for people on our Farsi platforms to submit questions, and then I went online and answered those questions. Another example of how we are trying to, we have 5 media platforms in Farsi, social media platforms. We read what they say. And so we're tracking what people are doing and their hopes and wishes for a better future.
I would like to ask you, sir, about Americans who are imprisoned in Iran. Iran refuses to give, for instance, any information on Bob Levinson. Iran is not responding to any calls to release these Americans. Can you do anything more? Can you push more about this on this issue?
We have somebody working full-time now, Robert O'Brien, who's working on trying to release these Americans. And it's not just Americans. We have the British also have some of their citizens who have been arbitrarily detained. This is a regime that uses human beings as political pawns. They do it to their own people. If you look at the report that we issued during the UN General Assembly, the last chapter of the report is about the environment and how this regime has destroyed the environment. There are people who protest. They just want clean air and clean water. This regime not only puts them in jail, the regime murders them. And it says something about a regime that's willing to kill people because they just want clean air and clean water. It's a tragedy, and it's an outrage that this sort of behavior goes on. But they do this to their own people, and they also do it to Americans. And so Bob Levinson, we still don't know. His family is suffering. I have talked with the wife of the Princeton University grad student that the Iranians picked up and put in jail. He was doing research on a doctoral dissertation at Princeton, and they accuse him of being a spy. It's absolutely ludicrous. And there's a real human cost to this, not only for the victims, but also their families. When I was in Vienna for a meeting of the Joint Commission, I asked for a meeting with Abbas Araghchi to talk about the people that they've arbitrarily detained, and I gave them the names of all the Americans, and I said these people have suffered long enough and they need to be released. It's this kind of behavior that also hurts the Iranian people. The United Nations has called out the Iranian regime for all of its hostage taking, and it makes Iran an international pariah, and it badly represents the Iranian people. This regime does a very bad job of representing the Iranian people, whom I don't believe chant death to America.
My last question, sir, about what you said is about what you said recently, that the administration is looking into the visas of the relatives of Iranian officials residing in the United States. Can you elaborate on that, please?
There are regime officials who have children who are here. It's an astonishing level of hypocrisy that these regime figures one day chant death to America and call us the great Satan, and then their kids come over and live here. And it's the double standard of this regime. The Iranian people know this. One of the consequences of being the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world is that it causes the United States and other countries to have to impose visa restrictions. The Iranian regime does not share information with us on a sufficient level. And so they know what they need to do. They know the behaviors that they need to change. The Iranian people understand that it is unfair for the regime to have its children here, and that same regime makes it very hard for its own people to get visas. These are some of the things that we are looking to change in getting into a much better place for a better future with the Iranian people.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hook.
Yeah, thanks.
Appreciate your time.